Great. So welcome everyone to Imagining the Environment series hosted by the Oslo Metropolitan University. I'm Rahul Ranjan. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow here, and I work for the Riverine Rights project that is also the host to the series. I work within the project on a case study that looks at Indian legal personhood, within which I also have a sub-theme that looks at the role of memory, grief, and the role of religious ecology in arguing for rights of the river. Just to give you a brief outline of why this series has been set up, the primary motivation behind the series is to foster a space to have a dialogue on primarily rivers, but also largely environmental histories and politics in South Asia. This series is a lecture series, which is in continuation with the seminar series I have hosted early on this year in the spring, where a lot of PhDs and early career graduate students had presented parts of their research. And it was called Perceptions of Environment. So this talk has bearing and sort of draws on from what had happened already in the spring semester. Now, this series, Imagining the Environment, is unique in a way that it combines a range of people who are placed in academia, do lots of research on history and environment politics in India, but also has a lineup of speakers who are journalists and have done sustained amount of work in this field. And I'm very thankful for, of course, Aruna today to have accepted my request to speak. This talk will go on for about an hour and a half, in which Aruna will speak for about 50 minutes or less or more she wishes to. And then we would have about this, time for discussion for about half an hour. As you can see, your cameras have been turned off for the reasons assume that you don't want to be recorded, but you have two options to ask question at the end. One is that you can use the chat box and write your question into the chat box, and I will have your question read at the end, but since Aruna is also the co-host, so she'll also have the access to question. And the second way is to just use the reaction emojis and raise your hand, and I'll have you unmute and you can ask your question yourself. To move to our speaker, I'm very, very thankful to Aruna that she's accepted our request. And I was extremely bad in rushing through emails while she was buried with lots of work with IPCC. To give a very short and brief introduction to Aruna, Aruna Chandrasekhar is an investigative journalist and has done a lot of research, photojournalism research, with a focus on corporate accountability, climate change, conflict, environmental and indigenous issue. She's finishing or has finished her master's as a Chevening scholar at University of Oxford. But I've also known and I must admit, have learned hugely from her work, especially during my PhD on land acquisition in Jharkhand and Adivasi conflict. So I'm very, very honored and thankful to Aruna for having accepted our request to speak today. So Aruna, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Rahul. This is a extremely rare honor, and also to have such an experienced and audience also with us that engages on so many of these issues, and have again to be part of these series of conversations that I think are incredibly important. We are now in a state where we are looking at the effects of raging conflict today, and right on the back of the IPCC report launch. So we are going to see, in a sense, of course, a lot of different parts of this conversation going through, which looks at both environment, conflict, and looks at a river that runs through as a sort of binding thread with all of them. So I usually sort of begin this by having this. I would like to take you on a bit of a journey and a bit of a presentation. And what you're going to see, or what we discussed here, is not numbers heavy. I'm sure. I think we all have a certain degree of fatigue with, and that should be in different reports. But for now, I think maybe just engaging on a sort of visual journey, and especially with the sort of focus that Rahul has had and maintained on looking at how we tell these stories, of course, of both of grief or of at the same time looking at what our relationships are with our rivers, but also to water and our, the rivers and everything being dependent on it. I think perhaps let me just go and hit screen sharing at this moment.
Aruna, just a second. So I have been told that your voice is not clear.
Okay, hold on. Let me just. Is it any better? Let me try and see if I can get a microphone or something. Is it clear enough?
I can hear you properly, but let me just see if Nadia has written.
Unfortunately, I still happen to live in India, or extremely fortunately in that case. But yes, there's going to be background. You can hear the trees and the wind. You might hear the sound of a cricket match somewhere. There's occasional honking. So, which to remind us that we don't exist in a vacuum, and there are various other environmental factors around us. So, if you can't hear me clearly, it would be good if there were bits and pieces. Right now, I've also just sort of using a sort of microphone at this stage, but if you can't, please feel free, and we can either catch up or try and do this in a different way. Does it sound okay now?
Yeah.
They're not able to hear.
Yeah, could you see through the chat, Aruna? I think someone has suggested if you could use the earphones.
Yeah, hold on a second. Okay, just give me a second.
Yeah.
And until then, Rahul, you can just take the reins. Okay.
Yeah, for the time she returns, for everyone here, if you have any question and if you face any difficulty in sharing from the Twitter, and as I understood, a lot of people are not on Twitter. I have curated an email in which I have included list of all the speaker with links that should help you get in. And I've sent it across to different riverine groups in India. But just in case if you do not have access, please write to me. I'll drop my email on the chat box. Yeah, just feel free also to make suggestion in case if you wish to contribute into this project. I'll just write my email.
Okay, technical difficulties and otherwise. Can you hear me better now? Sort of. I've done the suppressing of background noise and so on. Is this any better?
Yeah, I can hear you well. Yeah, I don't have, yes, I think, yeah, Nadia
Okay.
confirmed. Yeah.
I will start singing the national anthem to test it. No, I will not.
We can
Countries are weird constructs. Anyway, so glad for, and I mean, sorry for the interruptions and sorry to be that still somewhat a bit of a boomer in figuring out the various technological aspects of it. And it's extremely glad to have everyone stick around. So I'm just going to share my screen and do this. And if you tell me whether, okay. Just putting it. Yeah, this, I thought we would have an informal conversation around, changing course and how do we need to rethink our relationship with rivers. Now, this is a photo that was taken in Idukki district, where during Kerala's devastating floods. And it seems to have been, of course, a phenomenon that has repeated itself over and over again. Now, with the IPCC report, we know that there's no coming, that how we rethink um, whether it's construction or whether how and where we choose to live, or in terms of dams. Now, it was incredibly terrifying thing to both witness and see in person. But at the same time, I think a lot of us were um, really influenced by the mass of human compassion that also came to the fore to deal with the floods, to raise relief, and to make sure that it reached people on time. But I think some of the fundamental questions which were raised at that point, especially around how we choose to build, how we look at warnings, and at the same time, what is it that actually caused it? And I think now, and I think you have Kavita Upadhyay, who's going to be one of the future speakers and otherwise, especially talking about the role of dams and also the role of, especially in terms of climate and so on. How did I land up here? So just to give you an introduction to how I ended up in this space. Well, I as didn't always start off as an environmental journalist. I started off writing about culture, and at one point I used to work for a music magazine or push even stuff like Bollywood content and Katrina guest videos at different places. But and at that point, there were stories which were coming out around Operation Green Hunt, and a lot of the movements around land, water, and forests, which were starting to gain media attention, but not enough. And looking at some of these both photos as well as stories which are coming out of these regions were very close to where I grew up, which is in the city of Visakhapatnam on India's east coast. So the eastern side of India, it could almost be E is for extraction. The west gets is of course seen as a fertile biodiversity, but the east, unfortunately, by virtue of having a lot of natural resources, a lot of mineral wealth, that there is in terms of a disproportionate amount of extraction. So most of India's coal, iron ore, and various other mineral resources are around, especially on the East Coast and close to where I grew up. And a lot of the fights and resistance movements that were on at that time, incredibly powerful. And these were things that drew me in and made me ask certain questions of myself. Like, how was I, a woman of medium and more privilege from an upper caste community? How did I not know where my water was coming from? And where was my energy coming from? Where was my food coming from? These are questions that are never particularly addressed in high school or in any form of our education. We're given a sort of map, which is where you point out and you mark where are the mineral resources in different parts of the country. You look at, oh, this place is known for train building, this place is known for mica, this place is known for graphite. Never who lives there, what are these communities, what are the roles of rivers. Um, Again, looking at the interrelationship between ecologies as well as people and rivers. So these are not things that we explore as part of our schooling system, and it's only eventually as we stumble upon them. We know that certain rivers flow east and certain rivers flow west, and we can perhaps learn how to trace them onto a map. But where they originate and the sorts of conflicts and other things that accompany them, those are not something that we learn to articulate. So I started to travel and following resistance movement. So if you can see, these photos are around the Polavaram Dam, which is one of the biggest dams in that is being built in India. So I started as a very naive 22, 23-year-old and traveling around these villages. Human rights activists was like, okay, you want to see land conflicts? Let's walk around and let's. So we went in an auto rickshaw, which is like a tuk-tuk, from around 31 villages to ask people in communities what was, and did they know about the project? Did they know that they had rights? So there were around 200,000 indigenous people who will be displaced by this project and displaced by this dam, so that cities like mine can have access to drinking water. So, I mean, the sheer violence of trying to comprehend that, and how do you resettle or rehabilitate these many people? Now, one of the things that India continues to talk about is its right-wing agenda, but here, even a Ram temple, a really famous old one, is going to be part of the submerged zone. So we started speaking to people, both in submergence zone and slightly above it. And I think the questions over there, which is like in terms of access to information, you always show up being the person with the environmental impact assessment report and saying that, well, you're not really, I'm sorry, but you've not either the impacts on you have not been assessed, or the fact that this is information. How do you break the news to somebody that your village is going to be submerged? As a 23-year-old, this is being part of the becoming a doomsday prophet part of it, but also seeing people and their own reactions. For instance, the woman in the photo at the bottom was like, "No, you seem to think that the river is some benign force. In fact, she um, can be very volatile and very mad at times, and then we have to move further in. And when she floods her bank, and that's something that we've become accustomed to. So, what can man do in the face of that? Those seem to be valid questions. And as we know it, like we seem to look at rivers, or in India, this idea of a very benign maternal figure of nature, or rivers, or Ganga, and so on, seem to be things with that, or images that we seem to be dwelling upon, when realizing that rivers are powerful forces, not to be necessarily messed with, and especially, but looking at the cost of that, or the fact that this would go to drink water, made me sort of ask certain questions of who has a right or over the river, and who has, in terms of who was fighting for countries' water security of my region. So trying to build those dots was very essential. And at the same time, there's another river, which is again the Vamsadhara, another river that my city advisor gets water from. And at that point, one of the most famous struggles which was happening of indigenous resistance, and it continues to this day, because unfortunately there is no such thing as an environmental win. And it seems to be that's one of these are communities that have resisted for over a decade and a half right now and counting. So in terms of saying no to mining plans by a UK miner called Vedanta. So this is part of the Niyamgiri resistance movement. So if you can see the tiny shrine of the Niyam Raja, which is who they consider, the Dogre tribe um, consider the idea of natural law and of justice. And and some of the things that while at least my first few trips, or trying to speak with, or their understanding, is that you don't need a geologist to tell you that it is a bauxite that keeps the streams alive. And the communities also describe themselves as a journey as well, because of the number of waterfalls that originate on the hill, and which go to form the Vamsadhara. Now, so realizing that what their movement is, and the sort of repression that they're seeing by state and security forces, this was a fight not just for themselves and to veto mining plans on their land, which they did. And I think it was the first time that consent was considered, and indigenous consent was valued, or by the Supreme Court was like, it's not for us to decide, that they rejected these mining plans. But it wasn't just a win for them, even then temporarily. But it was, in that sense, it was for me and my elite family, opening on taking 3 showers a day and so on. So to be able to connect, and seeing that there are others who are resisting, not just for their resources, but for thinking beyond themselves. But here, if you can look at the mouth of the Vamsadhara River, which is the photograph at the bottom, is that's a fly ash, a pipeline that's dumping fly ash straight into the mouth of the river, which is, and if you look on top, that's Vedanta's alumina refinery, which is set up there, and that continues to operate. So you have, again, heavy metals, toxic content that's just really going in there, and to be able to see and witness this, and connect the dots that how were we okay with the sort of assessments that are being carried out, that seem to, and we, even those who are better informed, know much less about these impacts and about what is in our water, and especially with what that carries. and who it impacts along the way. So you can see the green fields around, especially in the tribal districts, as it makes its way, water makes its way towards my state, which is further south. But we continue to be oblivious to this. A lot of this becomes narrative, becomes, very much so in terms of, yes, their community, their God. But again, um, how do we see ourselves and connect ourselves? As urban dwellers, that's not something we think about because it's always something that's provided, and that we all imagine that you switch on a tap and makes its way to you seamlessly. You don't want to ask questions around it or what happens with it. So yeah, what happens with it? And now it's also a question of, like, let's say, one of the things that struck me when looking at or reporting on the Kerala floods was the fact that the state authorities or electricity authorities had assumed that it was going to be there was going to be lesser rainfall. So there's more insecurity that's growing around times of drought, around times of scarcity. That essentially what the reservoirs of many dams were even a quarter full before the monsoon. Typically, they're usually at zero, but this is to make sure that there was still uh, supply, or to make sure that there was still enough to generate, which was irresponsible. And the failure to monitor the fact that there were many extreme and heavy rainfall events. It was not just a one-day phenomena. So this question of, okay, looking at dams as means to control or to tame a raging river, and the simplistic nature of things, or thinking behind it, while at the same time trying to buffer up and think that you can shore up reserves so you can continue to generate electricity, or look at deal with or tide over water security. That forced uh, that made engineers also take the sorts of decisions. And when you had an extreme rainfall event, which was in a reservoir that was already close to full, getting to a stage where you're like, oh, everything is filling up around us. Okay, now this is where we sound the bell, and this is where we open all of the dam gates. And yeah, as you can see, the damage, meeting hundreds of families were displaced, and not knowing where you can go. And it's often, where would they be rehabilitated? Again, be in fragile areas in and around. So exposing them to even future and extensive risk. So as we know, a natural hazard isn't just a risk, but it's also a combination of vulnerability. And it also raised questions of how are we sort of planning for scarcity? How are we planning for, at the same time, extreme rainfall events? How are we planning how and where people can build and be housed? And how do we deal with floods year on year, especially if the sort of devastation that we leave in their wake, it really does drag whatever revenue shares or whatever economic benefits or developmental gains that have been in place, and that become the excuses to ignore the environment. The same things come and bite us in the back when we will be spending most of our money or most state revenues trying to barely even recover. So under India's Disaster Management Act, a lot of resources, I mean, in terms of disaster management funds, also require, they don't necessarily account for reconstruction. It's mostly, in terms of dealing with relief. So that these are burdens that states have to shoulder in this particular process. So will we be able to afford it? And can we afford to ignore the very, very alarming all caps sort of warning signals that are in our faces? And because one thing is for sure that this is going to happen year on year. So having to really absolutely rethink dams, how we operate them, but at the same time, what is our relationship to how are we going to relocate people? Are those the sort of options? And at the same time, there are other sorts of issues when, for instance, this is the in and around the Brahmani River in Orissa. So imagine you are a place, like maybe a lot of you might have watched uh, Black Panther or movies around and like that. So Sukinda is a village and is a sorry, Sukhinder is in Jajpur district in Orissa. So imagine being a place on earth that has 98% of the reserves of a single mineral. So that Sukhinder is unfortunately cursed with chromite reserves. Now, the word chromium might make people's maybe eyebrows raise or wonder where you've heard of it before. But yeah, all that glitters is not necessary, it can be pretty evil. Um, Chromium is used especially by the iron and steel industry. So your Tata Steels has its mines there. All of, I mean, Orissa, everyone keeps praising um, ministers for evacuating people during cyclones and so on. But this is a state where powerful ministers have mining interests in their own different companies. So if you can see on the left, that is how high, you know, ore is stacked. And at any point, these are things that are on the verge of collapse. So all of the chromium and all of the chromite mines leach into the rivers and to the different streams. Now, where have you heard of chromium or chromite before? If you remember the movie Erin Brockovich, um, that was what hexavalent chromium being in the water, one of the most toxic substances known to man and as a pollutant. And it is again soluble. So you are seeing the sort of, and it was ranked one of the seventh most polluted place on earth. Um, I mean, in terms of rankings, they will come and they will go, but uh, it is a pretty horrifying place to be around in. But all of this is sort of, and you're talking about cancer, you're talking about skin disease, you're talking about lung failure, you're talking about again kidney failure, different parts of and having to breathe the sort of mining dust that you can see around. Most of the communities also, I mean, are spending as much on health, and we're never really told that this is as a consequence of what's in the water and what is in the air. But again, like the water going down from there is going towards thousands and thousands of hectares of fields downstream. So if this is something which is seen as, you know, such an essential ingredient to India's development for something that supports or is essential to the steel industry, we continue or we seem to be ignoring how much of damage it's causing, not just in the area, but also downstream, and as well as the health impacts and costs. So, I mean, in the sense of looking at the relationship between extraction or how you can very casually pollute rivers. So I think that having to think of sort of this sort of substitutes for these materials that we talk about, these rare earths, those are things that are conversations that are important to have. Can we substitute this for something else? Just because 98% of a mineral is located, do we have to mine all of it in one single place? Is that a place that becomes sacrificed in that sense for perpetuity? So I remember somebody talking to me about the fact that, well, I mean, carbon fibers are replacing mica, but is that so we need to mine it? So I would have mining officials say things like, well, if God didn't put a mineral there for us to mine, then why did he put it there? So we're only just performing our duties. It becomes a very strange way of rationalizing it. But at the same time, I mean, when extreme weather events like um, you know, floods continue to hit, I think the damages that we assess are always from a distance. So it's like there's this constant visual of, for instance, maybe looking out at an airplane window and conducting an aerial survey of places and districts that are flooded. Not every place gets this. It is only if each of these floods get as much coverage as they do. And the Indian media, in terms of how we tend to cover extreme weather events or looking at, for instance, the Riverine River or floods every year, happens to be this is the format. And a lot of people wonder why there is this gazing out of the window and upon land. That's why our aerial survey is even necessary. But this is how, for instance, we determine how relief is distributed. So yeah, the prime minister is the head of the National Disaster Management Authority, the Home Minister and others have to assess the damage, see it for themselves, which they do at a very convenient distance, and then decide how much they should allocate and if states deserve any additional assistance in terms of financially. So why we've seen these wars over whether, okay, does the state get additional support? Do they not? Are they on the same page politically? Um, so the sort of games that make it much more vulnerable to political influence, that and a media that doesn't seem to interrogate that, but obviously will paste photographs of executives looking out and doing their supposed part of surveying how bad the damage is. But often those are things that we don't necessarily see. And I think climate reporting often being reduced to something that is as easily done. So, for instance, like if you were looking at Cyclone Amphan, it took a really long time for people to show up. It's like, okay, Bombay rains as close as you are to a television studio, and if this is happening around you, versus states like places like Bihar and Assam that flood every year, and that why the sort of questions of, is it getting worse? Why is it getting worse? I don't think one of the things that we struggle with is the fact that while there might even be like a small sliver of coverage, at some point a lot of attribution is missing. That I don't think I've heard the word climate change being connected to fossil fuels, even though they're starting to see it on different channels. It's more of a thing of government and authorities hiding behind bad choices around whether, okay, yes, of course, let's build an airport in a floodplain. And as we're seeing with a large parts of, for instance, Kolkata or Chennai, the choices which were made or which continue to be made are baffling and are often being both covered up with climate change, while again, climate impacts and the reasons why it happens in the first place are never really addressed. So yeah, I mean, and we continue to build dams. Now, this is perhaps one of the biggest. I think one of, especially when we talk about rivers and dams and so on. I think one bit of it that we don't necessarily address is also just the sheer mining cost of it. Like, I think dam constructions are among the biggest miners and like completely changing the topography of the area as well. For instance, this is a 240 million ton excavator, the biggest to be used, which was used or which is being used to cut and build the Polavaram Dam, which I showed you at the beginning. And you have all of lovely politicians in white shirts who are okaying the displacement of 200,000 people. Well, no, these are the contractors who get the contract to actually mine it. Yeah, standing right in the middle of that dipper and avoiding accountability generally for it. A lot of my work has also centered around coal, but then we are also seeing the costs of this and how we seem to be treating, assessing, and I think almost things coming back to full circle. For instance, on the left, the blurry image is actually from a video where a river raged and broke and started flowing through one of India's largest coal mines, which is, I think, quite currently fitting in a certain way that who would have chosen to mine or over a river spot, and surprisingly so, there are a lot of them. Or the fact that we don't seem to take this into consideration. This is something that we really need to rework our sort of thinking. If it was enough of a sign to sort of stop this, they continue to mine there and also set up more things in its park. On its top hand, I mean, on the other image is something that Avli also will be familiar with, of a barge carrying fly ash. So now we're mining so much coal that we don't really need in terms of an assessment. Basing this on sort of ideas that, well, India's poor needs electricity, but reports also show that we don't, that there is enough and we need to fix distribution systems, we need to sort of transition to other forms of energy. But we continue to be hooked to this and to one of the chief ingredients to causing the sort of climate impacts which are seen in the IPCC report that are being foretold. Um, and that brings us to also a situation where, well, the rivers are flowing into the mines, but also we are running out of space to store ash. So not only, I mean, are we starting to use inland waterways and thinking of in rivers which are experiencing more and more volatility of whether there is enough flow or is there enough flooding. We seem to have enough bag to want to send barges full of coal ash down the river and to export this to Bangladesh as something to make and build use the fly ash as building material or to construct. And and this is also ash that is going to have high radioactivity content in it. So I think really reconsidering, uh, I mean, the idea that we would want at this stage to think that inland waterways help reduce transport and shipping costs, or in terms of reducing freight and therefore reducing carbon emissions is something that this is justified in. So I think there is an immediate need to fix this broken thinking that if we are burning more, that we have even space to store, um, and of looking at how things are changing, that there is an immediate need to course correct. Yeah, so I think the sort of reporting that we're seeing of a lot of these events is very much, how close to the studios can you get and stand in the middle of a flooded street, whether it's in India or whether it's in Lahore. The sort of reporting continues to be extremely basic, while at the same time not focusing on the elements that are like where is data sharing, for instance. I think especially for rivers like the Brahmaputra, which have run through, again, if we're talking about the number of riparian states, there is an extreme amount of both concealment of data from China. There is, again, in terms of India's hesitancy and paranoia around China's dam building, so responding to it by building many of its own dams, the sort of geopolitical pressures as well that it started off this phase, and whether climate really affects it. And in terms of, okay, well, the Brahmaputra is more rainfall fed than it is from glacier melt. Do we have reasons to be as paranoid and spark this out? These are never, I mean, these are the sorts of questions that need to be asked when we are covering perhaps, let's say, the resistance movements in the Northeast against dams, or when we are looking at the fact that, again, the Brahmaputra flooding, or if those dams are built, whether Bangladesh, a nation that relies on its silt, um, pretty much very existentially, that are missing from our television coverage. And it seems to be that we are, of course, relying on the niche instead of where these are questions that need to be mainstream. But at the same time, also from a political standpoint, that states need to be sharing information. We need to be sharing as much data, giving each other scientific access, or especially when there are landslides or when there are multiple riparians affected by dams on rivers. Um, and at the same time of looking at future planning and even beginning to consider climate impact. I think a lot of our focus generally in these places continues to be, yes, we will meet at the UNFCCC, there we will be friends, but we will go at each other's throats, but refuse to share both information on loss and damage. We will not be learning from each other. So that's something that really needs to change, especially because if there are no multilateral dialogue or avenues for that, how are we going to prepare and contend around this? The good thing is that, yes, of course, you do have polycentric actors like ICIMOD or others who are, or again, various different specialist websites such as India-China Dialogue or looking at the third pole that seem to facilitate conversations that need to happen on this front. But to get states to talk to each other, whether it's again China, India, Bhutan, Nepal, around what happens around the Brahmaputra, those are forums that are still missing, that bring everyone onto the same page. So we seem to be acting in all of our own interests. While at the same time, we have, you know, journalists and inflatables. The cost of ignoring what both, and I'm sorry for this somewhat triggering image, and we'll flip back to it. But as we did see from earlier this year of bodies floating down the Ganga and the Yamuna corpses of for not having money yeah to at least to pay respect or pay their to those that they've lost because of the profound second wave or the horrifying second wave. Because we chose to ignore basic science, because we chose to, in spite of knowing better, um, and having these costs again being observed by countries' rivers. It's ironic because the Ganga has received a disproportionate amount of focus in Modi's, um, at least in manifestos, at least whether it was the first term as well as the second term. Now see what that sort of hubris has yielded in. Um, which while you wave a climate change flag and while you talk about again soft cultures such as again yoga and other things and India's per capita emissions or the poor who will shoulder them or who make us look good. The poor here didn't have even have money or to be able to bear the cost of funerals because being broken from a public healthcare system that ignores, for instance, like the chloride in the water, ash in the water, or the virus zoonotic diseases, or even things around basic public health and the environment. I think what we need is a politics that, and also connected to the Ganga, from every ton of coal, the Indian government has a tax, and which is actually quite novel. It was one of the first carbon taxes to actually be collected. Um, and this instead was meant as part of India's climate change trust fund. That has been diverted towards the Ganga, or large bits of it towards cleaning it up, building toilets and everything else around it, but without looking at many of the systemic effects. So I think getting off our high horses and getting off this idea of reverence and how we treat our rivers and looking at interconnectedness and also both trusting people's experiences and you know bringing them in towards as genuine, I mean, stakeholders. And I think instead of a just one-way conversation, to bring back public consultation, to figure out how we need to adapt collectively. These are questions that we need to be asking because we do need a new politics, and our rivers are showing us that. So on that note, I know Rahul would you like to take over and open to any questions or comments.
Yeah, sure. Could you stop sharing?
Yes, yes, in the process. Trying to figure out how to do that again. Yes, stop sharing.
Let me also end the recording.